The security guard's eyes lingered too long on Maya Santos as she approached the Veterans Affairs building entrance. His gaze swept from her pressed dress blues to the ribbon rack positioned precisely above her left breast pocket, then back to her face with barely concealed skepticism. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the concrete steps, but nothing was harsher than the doubt she'd grown accustomed to seeing in strangers' eyes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya adjusted her service cap slightly, a habit she'd developed over years of having her appearance scrutinized. The uniform fit her perfectly because she'd earned the right to wear it, but that truth seemed lost on most people who looked at her. At 28, with her slight build and youthful features, she didn't match what many expected a decorated combat veteran to look like. The assumptions followed her everywhere, like shadows she couldn't shake. The Veterans Affairs office buzzed with the familiar sounds of bureaucracy. Phones rang in steady rhythms, keyboards clicked against the backdrop of muted conversations, and somewhere in the distance, a copy machine hummed its mechanical song. Maya approached the reception desk with measured steps, her posture straight despite the weight of countless previous encounters that had started just like this one. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, looked up from her computer screen. Her nameplate read, Patricia Morris, and her expression held the tired patience of someone who'd seen it all. Maya removed her service cap and tucked it under her left arm, the gesture automatic after years of military protocol. "Good morning," Maya said, her voice carrying the crisp tone she'd perfected during her time in service. "I have an appointment at 9:30 with Mr. Davidson regarding my disability claim appeal." Patricia's fingers paused over her keyboard as she took in Maya's appearance. The uniform was immaculate, each ribbon positioned with mathematical precision, the fabric without a wrinkle or thread out of place. Yet something in the older woman's expression shifted, a subtle change that Maya had learned to recognize immediately. "May I see some identification, please?" Patricia asked, though her tone suggested the request was more than routine. Maya reached into her jacket pocket and produced her military ID card, placing it on the counter with steady fingers. Patricia picked up the card, examining it with the intensity of a jeweler inspecting a diamond. Her eyes moved between the photograph and Maya's face multiple times, as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit together in her mind. "This says you served in Afghanistan," Patricia said, her voice carrying a note of surprise that she didn't bother to hide. "That's correct. 2 deployments with the 82nd Airborne Division." Maya's response was matter-of-fact, devoid of the pride or defensiveness that others might have injected into such a statement. Patricia's gaze drifted to the ribbon rack on Maya's uniform, lingering on the distinctive blue and white stripes of the Medal of Valor nestled among other decorations. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and assumptions. Finally, Patricia handed back the ID card with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Davidson will see you shortly. Please have a seat in the waiting area." Maya nodded her thanks and moved to the row of plastic chairs that lined the wall beneath a series of faded military recruitment posters. She sat with her back straight, hands folded in her lap, service cap resting on her knee. The waiting area held the familiar mixture of veterans she'd encountered at every VA facility, men of various ages, most bearing the visible or invisible scars of their service. Their eyes found her with the same mixture of curiosity and skepticism she'd grown accustomed to. A heavy-set man in a worn baseball cap leaned toward his companion, lowering his voice but not quite enough to keep Maya from hearing. "Look at all those ribbons. No way someone that young earned all that hardware." His friend, a thin man with graying stubble, shook his head slowly. "Probably bought the whole setup online. Amazing what you can get these days. Hell, they even sell the uniforms with the ribbons already attached." Maya's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but she didn't turn her head or acknowledge the comments. She'd heard variations of the same conversation hundreds of times. The doubt always followed the same pattern. Her age, her appearance, the impossibility that someone like her could have served with distinction in combat zones that existed in their minds as places reserved for different kinds of people. 20 minutes passed before a tall man with a receding hairline emerged from a door marked James Davidson, Claim Specialist. He wore a rumpled suit that had seen better days and carried a manila folder thick with documents. His eyes found Maya immediately, and she recognized the same flicker of surprise that had crossed Patricia's face. Miss Santos. His voice held the professional courtesy of someone trained to treat all veterans with respect, but Maya caught the slight hesitation before her name. Yes, sir. Maya rose smoothly, replacing her service cap with practiced precision. Davidson gestured toward his office. Please, come in. I've been reviewing your file, and I have to say, it makes for quite interesting reading. They walked down a narrow hallway lined with motivational posters and official photographs of smiling politicians shaking hands with veterans. Davidson's office was small and cluttered, with stacks of files covering every available surface. He settled behind his desk and opened Maya's folder, spreading several documents across the surface. According to these records, you're claiming service-connected disabilities related to combat injuries sustained during Operation Enduring Freedom, Davidson said, adjusting his reading glasses as he scanned the paperwork. The medical reports are certainly comprehensive. Maya remained standing until Davidson gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat with the same rigid posture she'd maintained in the waiting room, her hands resting flat on her thighs. The injuries were sustained during a convoy ambush outside Kandahar in March of 2019, Maya replied. The medical documentation from both the field hospital and Walter Reed should be complete in the file. Davidson nodded slowly, but his expression remained skeptical. Yes, I see that. What I'm having difficulty understanding is how someone of your profile ended up in such a situation. The 82nd Airborne isn't exactly known for putting people like you in harm's way. The phrase hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them addressed directly. Maya had heard variations of it countless times. The suggestion that her service couldn't have been what she claimed, that someone like her wouldn't have been placed in dangerous situations, that her presence in a combat zone must have been limited to safe administrative roles. I served as a combat medic with Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, Maya said, her voice steady despite the familiar frustration building in her chest. My primary responsibility was providing medical support to infantry units conducting patrol and reconnaissance operations in active combat zones. Davidson flipped through several pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. These commendation letters are quite impressive. Bronze Star with V device, combat medical badge, and... He paused, his eyes finding the Medal of Valor citation. This is particularly notable. The Medal of Valor is rarely awarded, especially for the level of action described here. Maya's spine stiffened slightly. The citation described events she could recall with perfect clarity despite the years that had passed. The ambush that had changed everything, the moments when training took over, and instinct guided her actions, the weight of responsibility that had settled on her shoulders as she worked to keep her fellow soldiers alive under enemy fire. The citation describes your actions during a sustained enemy contact lasting over 4 hours, Davidson continued, reading from the document. According to this, you treated 17 wounded personnel while under direct fire, performed field surgery to save the life of your platoon sergeant, and coordinated the evacuation of casualties while continuing to engage enemy forces. That's correct. Maya's response was clipped, professional. Davidson set the citation aside and leaned back in his chair, studying Maya with unconcealed doubt. I have to be honest with you, Miss Santos. In my 15 years of handling veterans' claims, I've seen every kind of fraud and exaggeration imaginable. People purchase uniforms online, they falsify documents. They even go so far as to create elaborate backstories about service they never performed. Maya felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same anger that had sustained her through countless similar encounters. But she'd learned to channel that fire into cold, hard composure. Her voice remained level when she responded. Are you suggesting that my service record is fraudulent? I'm suggesting that I need more verification than what's been provided so far, Davidson replied, his tone taking on the bureaucratic detachment of someone delivering unwelcome news. These decorations, while impressive on paper, seem inconsistent with your profile. I'm going to need additional documentation, witness statements, and verification from your former commanding officers before I can approve any claims related to combat service. Maya stood slowly, her movements controlled despite the tremor of anger in her hands. Mr. Davidson, every document in that file has been verified through official military channels. My service record is a matter of public record through the Department of Defense. The decorations I wear were earned through actions witnessed by dozens of my fellow soldiers, many of whom are still serving. Davidson closed the folder with a decisive snap. I understand your position, Miss Santos, but I have a responsibility to verify all claims thoroughly. Given the unusual nature of your case, I'm going to need to conduct a more extensive review. This will likely take several additional months. Maya replaced her service cap, the gesture sharp, with barely contained frustration. Several months to verify documentation that has already been verified multiple times by multiple agencies. I'm sorry, but that's the process, Davidson replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly sorry at all. Maya left the office with her jaw clenched and her stride purposeful. The receptionist avoided eye contact as she passed, and the veterans in the waiting area watched her departure with expressions that ranged from sympathy to continued skepticism. The security guard at the entrance gave her the same lingering look as she exited, his eyes following her until she disappeared into the morning crowds. The doubt followed her everywhere like a persistent shadow. At the grocery store, cashiers would stare at her uniform during the brief stops she made between appointments. At the bank, tellers would examine her military ID with extra scrutiny. Even at the gym where she maintained her physical fitness standards, other veterans would question her credentials with barely concealed suspicion. Maya had learned to navigate these encounters with stoic professionalism, but each instance added another layer to the armor she'd built around her emotions. The truth of her service existed in official records, in the scars that marked her body, in the memories that sometimes jolted her awake in the middle of the night. But truth, she'd discovered, was often less powerful than perception in the civilian world she now inhabited. Her apartment reflected the same precision she brought to everything else in her life. The furniture was minimal and functional, arranged with military precision. A single bookshelf held her collection of medical texts and military history volumes, each spine aligned perfectly with its neighbors. On the wall above her desk hung a framed photograph of Alpha Company, taken shortly before the deployment that had changed everything. Maya studied the faces in that photograph every evening, remembering each name, each personality, each story that had ended or been forever altered by the events of that March day in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, whose life she'd saved with an emergency tracheotomy performed under enemy fire. Private Johnson, barely 19, who'd held pressure on a sucking chest wound while she worked on another casualty. Lieutenant Morrison, who'd recommended her for the Medal of Valor despite his own injuries. These were the people who knew the truth of her service, who had witnessed her actions under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Their testimony existed in official statements, in after-action reports, in the detailed citations that accompanied her decorations. Yet their voices seemed to carry less weight than the assumptions of strangers who judged her based on appearance alone. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from her former platoon sergeant, now a civilian, working as a construction foreman in North Carolina. Rodriguez checked in regularly, maintaining the bonds forged in combat, even as their paths had diverged in the civilian world. Heard from Morrison yesterday. He's putting together a reunion for next summer. You should come. The guys would love to see you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Maya smiled, despite her earlier frustration. Rodriguez understood what others couldn't, that the bonds formed in combat transcended the superficial differences that seemed to matter so much in the civilian world. In Afghanistan, under fire, nobody had questioned her credentials or doubted her capabilities. Results were the only currency that mattered, and Maya's results had spoken louder than any words. She typed a quick response acknowledging Rodriguez's message, then turned her attention to the stack of documents spread across her desk. Medical records, witness statements, official correspondence. All the paperwork required to prove what should have been self-evident. Each page represented hours of effort, phone calls to former colleagues, requests for verification that shouldn't have been necessary. The process was exhausting, not because of its complexity, but because of its fundamental injustice. Maya had served her country with distinction, had earned her decorations through actions that had saved lives, and upheld the highest standards of military service. Yet she found herself constantly required to prove what others took for granted, to justify her place in a community that should have welcomed her without question. As evening approached, Maya changed into civilian clothes and prepared for her shift at the community college, where she taught emergency medical response courses. The students there knew her as Professor Santos, a demanding but fair instructor who brought real-world experience to her teaching. Most had no idea about her military background, and she preferred it that way. In the classroom, her knowledge and competence were evaluated based on results rather than assumptions. The drive to the college took her through downtown, past the Veterans Memorial Park where a ceremony was scheduled for the following week. Maya had been invited to participate as a representative of female combat veterans, an honor that came with its own complications. She'd accepted the invitation, knowing that her presence might spark the same doubts and questions she encountered everywhere else. But visibility, she'd learned, was part of the responsibility that came with her decorations. Maya's students were waiting when she arrived at the classroom, their faces eager with anticipation for the evening's lesson on trauma response in mass casualty situations. These were mostly young adults pursuing careers in emergency services, people who understood that competence mattered more than appearance when lives hung in the balance. Tonight we're going to discuss triage protocols in situations where medical resources are limited and casualties are numerous, Maya began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived the scenarios she was about to describe. The decisions you make in these situations will determine who lives and who dies. There's no room for hesitation, no time for second-guessing. The students leaned forward, recognizing the weight in her words. Over the next 2 hours, Maya guided them through scenarios that drew heavily on her combat experience. Though she rarely mentioned the source of her knowledge directly, she demonstrated techniques she'd perfected under fire, shared insights gained through experiences that had tested the limits of her training and resolve. After class, a young woman named Jessica approached the podium with obvious nervousness. She was one of Maya's most dedicated students, someone who asked thoughtful questions and stayed after class to discuss complex medical procedures. "Professor Santos," Jessica began, her voice uncertain, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but some of the techniques you teach, they're not in any of our textbooks. Where did you learn them?" Maya paused in gathering her materials, considering how much to reveal. "Combat experience tends to accelerate learning in ways that textbooks can't replicate," she said finally. "When failure means death, you develop techniques and instincts that go beyond conventional training." Jessica's eyes widened with understanding. "You served in the military?" "I did." Maya's response was simple, offering no elaboration. "Were you deployed?" Maya met the young woman's gaze directly. "Afghanistan. 2 deployments with the 82nd Airborne." Jessica's expression shifted from curiosity to awe. "That's incredible. I mean, the things you've taught us suddenly make so much more sense. You were actually there, actually doing this under fire." Maya nodded slowly. "The principles remain the same, whether you're treating casualties in a combat zone or responding to a civilian emergency. Assess, prioritize, act. Everything else is just noise." Jessica thanked her and left with obvious excitement, probably eager to share what she'd learned about her mysterious professor with her classmates. Maya finished packing her materials, knowing that by tomorrow, word would have spread throughout the program. Some students would look at her with new respect, others with curiosity, and a few with the same skepticism she encountered everywhere else. The drive home took her past the Veterans Affairs building, where she'd spent her frustrating morning. The parking lot was empty now, the building dark except for security lights that cast long shadows across the concrete. Maya slowed as she passed, thinking about Davidson and his demands for additional verification, about the months of delay he'd imposed on her claim, about the casual dismissal of documentation that should have been sufficient. Tomorrow would bring another day of similar challenges. Phone calls to former commanding officers, requests for witness statements, the endless bureaucratic dance required to prove what should have been self-evident. Maya had learned to approach each obstacle with the same methodical precision she'd applied to everything else in her life. But the cumulative weight of constant doubt was exhausting in ways that combat had never been. In combat, challenges were straightforward. Enemy fire, casualties requiring treatment, tactical problems with clear solutions. The environment was hostile, but the objectives were unambiguous. Success and failure were measured in lives saved, missions accomplished, duties fulfilled. The civilian world operated by different rules, where perception often mattered more than reality, where assumptions carried more weight than evidence. Maya pulled into her apartment complex parking lot and sat in her car for several minutes, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability that she rarely permitted. The day's encounters replayed in her mind, Davidson's skeptical questions, the whispered comments in the waiting room, the security guard's lingering stares. Each incident was minor on its own, but together they formed a pattern of doubt that followed her everywhere. Her phone buzzed with another message from Rodriguez. Remember what Morrison used to say: courage isn't the absence of fear. It's action in spite of fear. You've got more courage than anyone I know. Don't let the civilians get you down. Maya smiled at the message, remembering Lieutenant Morrison's habit of delivering impromptu motivational speeches during the quiet moments between missions. Morrison had been the kind of leader who inspired loyalty through personal example, someone who never asked his soldiers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. His recommendation for Maya's Medal of Valor had been written from his hospital bed, dictated to a nurse while he recovered from wounds sustained in the same ambush that had earned Maya her decoration. The memory strengthened Maya's resolve. Morrison had seen her actions under the worst possible circumstances and deemed them worthy of the nation's highest recognition for valor. Rodriguez had trusted her with his life and credited her with saving it. Dozens of soldiers had returned home to their families because of her medical skills and courage under fire. These truths existed independent of civilian skepticism and bureaucratic doubt. Maya locked her car and walked toward her apartment building, her posture straight despite the day's accumulated frustrations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new encounters with people who questioned her credentials and doubted her service. But it would also bring opportunities to prove herself again, to demonstrate the competence and dedication that had earned her place among America's decorated veterans. The apartment was dark and quiet when she entered, a sanctuary from the outside world's constant scrutiny. Maya hung her uniform carefully in the closet, each piece positioned with the same precision she'd learned during her first days of basic training. The ritual was calming, a reminder of the standards she maintained regardless of external recognition or doubt. As she prepared for bed, Maya caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at her was the same one that had confused Davidson and the VA receptionist, the same one that prompted whispered doubts and skeptical stares. But Maya saw something different in that reflection. The eyes of someone who had faced the ultimate test and emerged stronger, someone who had earned her place through actions rather than assumptions. The Medal of Valor rested in its presentation case on her dresser, the distinctive ribbon and medallion catching the light from her bedside lamp. Maya had earned that decoration through 4 hours of sustained combat, treating wounded soldiers while under direct enemy fire, making life-and-death decisions that had saved 17 lives. The medal represented not just her individual courage, but the trust her fellow soldiers had placed in her abilities. That trust had been absolute and unquestioning. Under fire, nobody had doubted Maya's credentials or questioned her right to wear the uniform. Results were the only measure that mattered, and Maya's results had spoken with unmistakable clarity. 17 soldiers had returned home because of her actions. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was alive because she had performed emergency surgery while bullets whistled overhead. Private Johnson had survived because she had trained others to provide effective first aid under combat conditions. These were the truths that sustained Maya through the daily challenges of civilian life, where her service was constantly questioned and her decorations viewed with suspicion. The doubt would continue, she knew. Tomorrow would bring more skeptical stares, more demands for additional verification, more whispered comments about the impossibility of her achievements. But Maya had faced far worse challenges than civilian skepticism and emerged victorious. The Medal of Valor represented more than individual recognition. It was a symbol of the trust placed in her by fellow soldiers, the faith they had shown in her abilities when everything was on the line. That trust had been earned through actions, through competence demonstrated under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. No amount of civilian doubt could diminish the reality of what she had accomplished or the lives she had saved. Maya turned off the bedside lamp and settled into bed, her mind already planning for the challenges ahead. The bureaucratic battles would continue, the skeptical encounters would multiply, and the demands for additional proof would never fully cease. But she would face each obstacle with the same methodical precision that had served her in combat, the same unwavering dedication that had earned her place among America's most decorated veterans. The darkness of her apartment was peaceful, a stark contrast to the scrutiny she faced in daylight. In the quiet moments before sleep, Maya allowed herself to remember the weight of Rodriguez's hand on her shoulder as medics loaded him onto the evacuation helicopter. his whispered thanks barely audible over the rotor noise. She remembered Lieutenant Morrison's proud smile as he pinned the combat medical badge to her uniform, the respect in his eyes as he acknowledged her contribution to the unit's success. These memories were her anchor, the unshakable foundation that supported her through every challenge the civilian world could offer. Maya had proven herself under the ultimate test, had earned her decorations through actions that saved lives, and upheld the highest traditions of military service. The truth of her achievements existed independent of recognition or acceptance, a reality that no amount of doubt could diminish. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new opportunities to demonstrate the competence and dedication that defined her character. Maya would face each challenge with the same courage that had earned her the Medal of Valor, the same unwavering commitment that had saved 17 lives under enemy fire. The civilian world might question her credentials and doubt her achievements, but the truth of her service would eventually prevail. As sleep approached, Maya's last conscious thought was of her fellow soldiers, the men and women who had served alongside her and witnessed her actions under fire. Their trust had been absolute, their respect unquestioned. That trust and respect had been earned through actions rather than assumptions, through results rather than perceptions. It was a foundation strong enough to support her through any challenge the future might bring. The call came at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning, jarring Maya from the deep sleep she'd finally managed to achieve after weeks of restless nights. Her hand found the phone on the first ring, muscle memory from years of military service making the response automatic even in her groggy state. "Professor Santos." The voice on the other end was tight with barely controlled panic. "This is Director Harrison from the Regional Emergency Management Agency. We have a situation developing downtown and we need your expertise immediately." Maya sat up in bed, instantly alert. Harrison's voice carried the kind of urgency that cut through any lingering drowsiness. "What's the situation?" "Construction accident at the Meridian Tower project. Partial building collapse with multiple casualties trapped in the debris. Our initial response teams are overwhelmed, and we need someone with mass casualty experience to coordinate medical triage on site." Maya was already moving, pulling on clothes with practiced efficiency. "How many casualties are we looking at?" "Preliminary reports suggest at least 30 construction workers were in the affected area when the scaffolding failed." "Could be more. We're setting up a command post 3 blocks south of the site. Can you be there in 20 minutes? "I'll be there in 15. Maya ended the call and grabbed her emergency response kit, a carefully organized collection of medical supplies and equipment she maintained for exactly these situations. The kit reflected her military training, with every item positioned for maximum efficiency and rapid deployment. The drive through the pre-dawn streets was a blur of flashing emergency lights and racing thoughts. Maya's mind automatically shifted into the analytical mode that had served her so well in combat, processing information and formulating response strategies even as she navigated through the chaos of emergency vehicles converging on the disaster site. The scene that greeted her downtown was controlled pandemonium. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police vehicles filled the streets surrounding the construction site, their emergency lights painting the early morning darkness in alternating patterns of red and blue. The Meridian Tower, a 40-story high-rise that had been nearing completion, now stood as a monument to structural failure. 3 floors of scaffolding and concrete had pancaked into the street below, creating a mountain of twisted metal and debris that stretched across 2 city blocks. Harrison met Maya at the command post, a hastily erected tent staffed with emergency coordinators and communication specialists. He was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades managing disasters. His handshake was firm and grateful. "Professor Santos, thank God you're here. This is beyond anything our local teams have dealt with before. We have search and rescue crews working to locate survivors, but the medical coordination is... He gestured helplessly toward the chaos surrounding them. "We're not equipped for something this large." Maya surveyed the scene with the systematic assessment that had become second nature during her combat deployments. Multiple ambulances were staged at various points around the perimeter, but there was no clear organization to the medical response. Paramedics and EMTs were working individually rather than as part of a coordinated effort, and she could see the confusion that inevitably developed when responders operated without central medical command. "Who's currently in charge of medical triage?" Maya asked, already knowing the answer from the disorganized activity she observed. That's the problem. We have senior paramedics from 4 different departments, but no one with the authority or experience to coordinate a response this size. Everyone's doing their best, but there's no unified command structure. Maya nodded, understanding the challenge immediately. Mass casualty incidents required a different approach from normal emergency response, one that prioritized resource allocation and systematic decision-making over individual patient care. It was a harsh calculus that civilian responders often struggled with, but one that Maya had mastered during her deployments in Afghanistan. "I need authority to establish unified medical command," Maya said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had earned respect from soldiers and students alike. "Everyone working medical response needs to report through a single chain of command, or we're going to have chaos instead of coordination." Harrison didn't hesitate. "Done. As of right now, you're the medical incident commander. What do you need?" Maya was already moving toward the staging area where paramedics and EMTs had gathered their equipment. The transition from civilian professor to military commander was seamless, years of training and experience coalescing into the focused authority that emergency situations demanded. "I need all medical personnel to converge at the primary staging area in 5 minutes, Maya called out, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the disaster scene. "We're implementing unified triage protocols immediately." The response was mixed. Some paramedics moved toward her location without hesitation, recognizing the authority in her voice and the necessity of coordination. Others hesitated, unsure about taking orders from someone they didn't recognize, someone who looked too young and too small to be commanding a major emergency response. Maya addressed the group as they assembled, her bearing unmistakably military despite her civilian clothes. "I'm Professor Santos, from the Community College Emergency Response Program. I've been designated as Medical Incident Commander for this operation. We're going to establish systematic triage protocols to ensure we're using our resources effectively." A heavy-set paramedic with sergeant stripes on his uniform stepped forward, his expression skeptical. "No offense, Professor, but this isn't a classroom exercise. We're dealing with real casualties here, and some of us have been working emergency response for 20 years. Maya met his gaze directly, her voice remaining calm and professional. "You're absolutely right. This isn't a classroom, which is why we need to implement the same mass casualty protocols that have been proven effective in combat zones. Individual heroics won't save lives here. Systematic coordination will." She turned to address the broader group. "We're going to establish 3 triage zones. Red zone for immediate life-threatening injuries requiring immediate transport. Yellow zone for serious injuries that can wait up to an hour. Green zone for walking wounded who can be treated and released on site. Every casualty gets tagged and tracked through the system." The skeptical paramedic crossed his arms. "And who made you an expert on mass casualty incidents? I don't see any department credentials on your jacket." The question hung in the air, and Maya felt the familiar weight of doubt settling over the gathered responders. She could see the uncertainty in their faces, the same skepticism she encountered daily in civilian life. But lives were at stake, and there was no time for the bureaucratic dance that usually accompanied challenges to her authority. "I earned my expertise treating mass casualties under fire in Afghanistan," Maya replied, her voice carrying a steel edge that hadn't been present before. "2 deployments with the 82nd Airborne, where I coordinated medical response for incidents involving dozens of wounded personnel while under enemy attack. The principles are the same whether the casualties are caused by IEDs or construction accidents." The skeptical paramedic's expression didn't change. "Anyone can claim military service. I'm not taking orders from someone just because they say they served in Afghanistan." Maya felt the situation teetering on the edge of complete breakdown. The other responders were watching the confrontation, waiting to see how it resolved before deciding whether to follow her lead or continue with their individual efforts. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of search and rescue teams working to locate survivors in the debris, each minute of delay potentially meaning the difference between life and death for the trapped workers. "Sergeant Mitchell." The voice came from behind the group, carrying the unmistakable authority of rank and years of service. Maya turned to see a woman in her 40s wearing the uniform of a fire department captain, her bearing immediately recognizable as military despite the civilian emergency response gear. "Captain Rodriguez, thank God you're here," Harrison said, relief evident in his voice. We need a unified command structure for the medical response. Captain Rodriguez approached Maya, studying her with the assessing gaze of someone trained to evaluate personnel under pressure. You're the medical commander? Yes, ma'am. Professor Santos, emergency response instructor. Maya's response was automatic, the military courtesy that had been drilled into her during years of service. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed slightly. Santos. You wouldn't happen to be Maya Santos, formerly with the 82nd Airborne? Maya felt a flutter of surprise. Yes, ma'am. Do we know each other? Not personally, but I know your reputation. Captain Elena Rodriguez, formerly with the 10th Mountain Division. I was at Bagram when word came through about the Kandahar ambush. Your actions that day became required reading in our combat medic training program. The atmosphere among the gathered responders shifted perceptibly. Sergeant Mitchell's skeptical expression wavered as he processed this unexpected validation. Other paramedics and EMTs who had been watching the confrontation with uncertainty began to step closer, their attention focused on the exchange between the two veterans. Rodriguez continued, her voice carrying the weight of professional respect. The citation for your Medal of Valor was circulated through all medical units as an example of exemplary performance under fire. 17 casualties treated during sustained enemy contact, including field surgery that saved your platoon sergeant's life. Is that correct? Maya's spine straightened involuntarily. Yes, ma'am. These people couldn't be in better hands. Rodriguez turned to address the assembled responders. Ladies and gentlemen, you're looking at one of the most decorated combat medics in recent military history. If she says we need unified triage protocols, then that's exactly what we're going to implement. The transformation was immediate and complete. Sergeant Mitchell stepped forward, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional respect. What do you need from us, Commander? Maya felt the familiar surge of confidence that came with recognized authority. But more importantly, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Lives depended on the decisions she would make in the next few hours, just as they had during that March day in Afghanistan when everything had changed. I need 3 teams, Maya began, her voice carrying the clear authority of someone accustomed to command. Team Alpha will establish the red zone triage area in the parking structure across the street. Maximum protection from debris, easy ambulance access. Team Bravo sets up yellow zone triage in the plaza area north of the collapse site. Team Charlie establishes green zone treatment in the community center lobby. She pointed to specific locations as she spoke, her tactical assessment of the area immediately apparent to the military-trained responders in the group. All casualties get initial assessment at the point of rescue, then transported to appropriate triage zones based on severity. No exceptions, no individual decision-making. The system only works if everyone follows protocol. The response was immediate and professional. Paramedics and EMTs dispersed to their assigned areas, their earlier hesitation replaced by focused efficiency. Captain Rodriguez remained at Maya's side as they established the command post that would coordinate all medical activities. It's good to see a fellow veteran taking charge, Rodriguez said as they watched the triage zones taking shape. Civilian responders mean well, but they don't understand the mathematics of mass casualty situations. Maya nodded, understanding the harsh reality that Rodriguez referenced. In combat, medical personnel learned to make decisions based on resource allocation and probability of survival, choices that could seem callous to those unfamiliar with the grim calculus of triage. But those decisions saved more lives than individual heroics ever could. The first casualties began arriving from the collapse site 20 minutes later. Maya positioned herself at the primary triage point, where every rescued worker would receive initial assessment before being directed to the appropriate treatment area. The systematic approach that had served her in combat adapted seamlessly to the civilian emergency, each decision flowing from training and experience rather than emotion or impulse. The first casualty was a construction foreman in his 50s, conscious but with obvious signs of internal injuries. Maya's assessment was swift and thorough, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she checked vitals and evaluated trauma indicators. Red zone, immediate transport, she called out, tagging the patient and directing the paramedics toward the high-priority treatment area. Possible internal bleeding, potential spleen laceration. Alert the trauma center for incoming surgical case. The next casualty presented with multiple fractures but stable vitals. Yellow zone can wait up to an hour for transport, Maya determined. applying the same systematic evaluation that had saved lives in far more chaotic circumstances. The rhythm was familiar, despite the civilian setting. Assess, prioritize, direct, move to the next case. Each decision was made with the understanding that resources were limited and had to be allocated where they would do the most good. It was the same approach that had enabled her to treat 17 wounded soldiers while under enemy fire, the same methodology that had earned her the Medal of Valor. As the morning progressed, more casualties arrived from the debris field. Maya's reputation spread among the rescue teams, who began to trust her assessments implicitly. The systematic approach she had implemented was producing results, with casualties being treated and transported in order of medical priority rather than the chaos that typically characterized major emergency responses. A young construction worker, barely out of his teens, was carried to the triage point with severe crush injuries to his legs. Maya's assessment was grim but professional, her training allowing her to separate emotional response from medical necessity. Red zone. Highest priority, she determined, though privately she calculated the young man's chances of survival as marginal at best. The decision to allocate critical resources to him meant other casualties would wait longer for treatment, but the systematic approach demanded that medical priority take precedence over probability assessments. Captain Rodriguez approached as Maya finished tagging the casualty. The mayor's office is sending a news crew. They want to interview the medical commander about the response effort. Maya's jaw tightened slightly. Media attention was the last thing she needed, particularly when her authority was already being questioned by some responders. I'd prefer to focus on the medical response rather than publicity. Unfortunately, that's not an option. The mayor wants to show that the city is responding effectively to the crisis. You're the face of that response. Maya nodded reluctantly, understanding the political necessities even as she resented the distraction from medical operations. Keep it brief. Every minute I'm not coordinating, triage is a minute that could cost lives. The news crew arrived as the rescue operation entered its 4th hour. Maya had treated or directed treatment for over 40 casualties by that point. Her systematic approach enabling the medical response to operate with military efficiency despite the civilian setting. The reporter was a polished woman in her 30s who approached the situation with the superficial urgency that characterized television journalism. She thrust a microphone toward Maya while cameras rolled, her questions focused more on drama than substance. Can you tell our viewers about the challenges you're facing in coordinating this massive rescue operation? The reporter began. Maya's response was measured and professional. The key to effective mass casualty response is systematic triage and resource allocation. We've implemented protocols that ensure casualties receive appropriate care based on medical priority rather than order of arrival. And what qualifies you to take command of such a major emergency response? The question carried the same skeptical undertone Maya had encountered throughout her civilian career, the implicit doubt about her credentials and authority. She was aware that thousands of viewers would be forming impressions based on her response, but she also knew that any attempt at self-promotion would undermine her credibility with the responders she was leading. I have extensive experience with mass casualty incidents from my military service, Maya replied simply. The principles of combat medicine apply directly to civilian emergency response. The reporter pressed for more details, but Maya deflected the questions and returned to her medical duties. The interview would air during the evening news cycle, she knew, and her brief responses would be analyzed and critiqued by viewers who had never faced the responsibility of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. The rescue operation continued throughout the afternoon as search teams worked methodically through the debris field. Maya's triage protocols had established a rhythm that maximized the efficiency of available medical resources. But the scope of the disaster was testing the limits of the regional emergency response system. By late afternoon, the last survivor had been extracted from the collapsed scaffolding. The final casualty count stood at 38 injured workers, with Maya having coordinated treatment for every one of them. The systematic approach she had implemented had enabled medical teams to prioritize resources effectively, ensuring that the most critically injured received immediate attention while maintaining care for less serious cases. Captain Rodriguez approached Maya as the operation began to wind down, her expression reflecting professional satisfaction with the day's work. Outstanding performance, Commander. That was military-level coordination applied to civilian emergency response. You probably saved a dozen lives today through proper resource allocation alone. Maya felt the familiar mixture of pride and exhaustion that followed major medical operations. The systematic approach had worked exactly as intended, demonstrating that her combat-tested methods could adapt effectively to civilian emergencies. But she also knew that questions would follow, the same skepticism that shadowed all her professional achievements. The protocols worked because everyone followed them, Maya replied, deflecting the individual praise in favor of acknowledging the team effort. Effective triage is only possible when responders trust the system and follow established procedures. As emergency teams began the process of demobilizing from the scene, Maya packed her medical kit with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. The day had been a professional success, demonstrating her ability to command complex medical operations under pressure, but she suspected that the broader implications would take time to develop. Sergeant Mitchell, the paramedic who had initially challenged her authority, approached as she prepared to leave. His earlier skepticism had been replaced by obvious respect, the transformation reflecting his recognition of her competence under pressure. "I owe you an apology, Commander," he said, his voice carrying genuine humility. "I've been working emergency response for 20 years, and I've never seen medical coordination that effective. You probably saved lives today that would have been lost in the usual chaos." Maya accepted the apology with professional grace, understanding that Mitchell's initial skepticism had been based on legitimate concerns about command authority in emergency situations. The system works when everyone commits to following it. Your teams performed exceptionally once we established clear protocols. The drive home took Maya through streets that bore no evidence of the day's drama except for the lingering presence of emergency vehicles around the disaster site. The systematic response she had coordinated was already being evaluated and documented by emergency management officials, but Maya knew that the real test would come in the days and weeks that followed. Her apartment felt strangely quiet after the controlled chaos of the emergency response. Maya hung up her jacket and settled at her desk, where she began the process of documenting the day's medical operations. The after-action report would become part of the official record, but more importantly, it would serve as a training tool for future emergency responses. The systematic approach she had implemented reflected years of military training and combat experience, but it also demonstrated principles that could be taught to civilian responders. Maya found herself thinking about ways to incorporate mass casualty protocols into her emergency response curriculum, sharing the lessons learned through hard experience with students who might one day face similar challenges. Her phone rang as she worked on the documentation, the caller ID showing Rodriguez's contact information. Maya answered with the professional courtesy that had become automatic during her years of service. "Maya, it's Elena Rodriguez. I wanted to follow up on today's operation and discuss something that might interest you." "What can I do for you, Captain?" "I've been talking with some colleagues about establishing a regional mass casualty response team, something that could be deployed to major emergencies throughout the state. Today's operation demonstrated exactly why we need that capability, and you'd be perfect to lead the medical component." Maya leaned back in her chair, considering the implications of Rodriguez's proposal. A formal role in emergency response would provide official recognition for her expertise, but it would also expose her to the same skepticism she encountered in all her professional activities. "I'm interested in hearing more about the concept," Maya replied carefully. "What kind of authority structure are you envisioning?" "State-level emergency management, probably reporting directly to the governor's office during major incidents. Full command authority over medical response, with the ability to coordinate resources across multiple jurisdictions." The opportunity was appealing, offering a chance to apply her military expertise in a context where it could make a significant difference. But Maya also understood that such a position would involve constant scrutiny, with every decision analyzed and critiqued by officials and media who might not understand the harsh realities of mass casualty response. "Let me think about it," Maya said finally. "Today's operation went well, but I know there will be questions about the command decisions I made. People don't always understand why systematic triage requires some casualties to wait, while others receive immediate attention." Rodriguez's laugh carried understanding born of shared military experience. "That's exactly why we need someone with your background. Civilian officials make decisions based on politics and public perception. Military-trained commanders make decisions based on results and resource allocation. After ending the call, Maya returned to her after-action report with renewed focus. The documentation would become part of the official record of the day's emergency response, but it would also serve as evidence of her ability to command complex operations under pressure. The skepticism would continue, she knew, but today's operation had provided concrete demonstration of her competence. The Medal of Valor rested in its case on her dresser, the ribbon and medallion reflecting the light from her desk lamp. Maya had earned that decoration through actions that saved 17 lives under enemy fire, demonstrating the same systematic approach to mass casualty treatment that had proven effective during the construction site disaster. The principles remained constant, whether the casualties resulted from enemy action or structural failure. Maya finished her documentation as evening settled over the city. The after-action report detailed every aspect of the medical response, from initial triage protocols to final casualty disposition. The systematic approach she had implemented had proven effective, enabling medical teams to treat 38 casualties with maximum efficiency and minimal confusion. The day's operation would generate discussion and analysis among emergency management officials, she knew. Some would focus on the successful coordination of resources, while others might question specific command decisions or challenge the authority structure that had been implemented. Maya had learned to expect such scrutiny, understanding that her achievements would always be examined more closely than those of others. But the results spoke for themselves. 38 construction workers had received appropriate medical care based on systematic assessment and resource allocation. Lives had been saved through proper triage protocols and unified command structure. The principles of combat medicine had proven their effectiveness in civilian emergency response, demonstrating the value of military training and experience. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from one of her students, someone who had seen the television coverage of the rescue operation. "Professor Santos, was that you on the news coordinating the emergency response? That was incredible to watch." Maya smiled at the message, remembering Jessica's excitement when she had learned about her professor's military background. Her students understood competence when they saw it, evaluating her teaching based on results rather than assumptions about her background or appearance. The television news would air more coverage of the rescue operation during the late evening broadcasts, Maya knew. Her brief interview would be analyzed by viewers who had never faced the responsibility of commanding major emergency responses, people who would form opinions based on 30-second sound bites rather than understanding of complex operational requirements. Maya prepared for bed with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else in her life. The day had been a professional success, demonstrating her ability to adapt military expertise to civilian emergency response. But she also understood that success would bring increased scrutiny, more questions about her background and qualifications. The skepticism would continue, following her like a persistent shadow through every professional achievement. But Maya had faced far greater challenges than civilian doubt and emerged stronger. The Medal of Valor represented more than individual recognition. It was proof of her ability to perform under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. As she settled into bed, Maya's thoughts turned to the 38 construction workers who had received treatment during the day's operation. Each had benefited from the systematic approach she had implemented, the same methodology that had saved lives during her combat deployments. The principles remained constant, regardless of setting or circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. Questions about today's command decisions, requests for interviews and explanations. The familiar pattern of doubt and skepticism that accompanied all her achievements. But Maya had proven herself once again, demonstrating the competence and leadership that had earned her place among America's most decorated veterans. The truth of her service existed in official records and witness testimony, but more importantly, it existed in the lives she had saved through systematic application of military training and experience. Today's emergency response had provided another chapter in that record, 38 more reasons why her military expertise remained relevant and valuable. Maya's last conscious thought before sleep was of Captain Rodriguez's proposal for a regional mass casualty response team. The opportunity appealed to her professional instincts, offering a chance to apply her expertise in a context where it could make a significant difference. But she also understood that such a position would expose her to constant scrutiny from those who questioned her qualifications. The decision could wait, she realized. Today's operation had demonstrated her capabilities under pressure, providing concrete evidence of her ability to command complex medical responses. The results spoke louder than any credentials or decorations, offering proof that transcended skepticism and doubt. The construction site disaster had tested her abilities in ways that civilian life rarely demanded, creating conditions similar to the combat environments where she had earned her military decorations. The systematic approach had proven effective, saving lives through proper resource allocation and unified command structure. It was validation of everything she had learned during her military service, confirmation that her expertise remained relevant and valuable. The auditorium at the State Veterans Convention Center buzzed with the controlled energy of 500 veterans gathered for the annual recognition ceremony. Representatives from every branch of service filled the tiered seating, their dress uniforms creating a sea of navy blue, army green, and Air Force blue that stretched from the stage to the back rows. Maya sat in the third row, her own dress blues immaculate, despite the scrutiny she knew they would receive from those around her. The ceremony had been planned for months, designed to honor veterans who had made significant contributions to their communities since returning from military service. Maya's role in coordinating the construction site emergency response had earned her a place among the honorees, though she suspected her inclusion had generated the same skepticism that followed her everywhere else. 3 weeks had passed since the Meridian Tower disaster, and the aftermath had unfolded exactly as Maya had anticipated. The local media had covered the successful rescue operation extensively, but much of the coverage had focused on her unlikely appearance as the medical commander rather than the systematic approach that had saved lives. Editorial pieces questioned how someone so young could have commanded such a complex emergency response, while online comments sections filled with familiar doubts about her military credentials. Maya had weathered the scrutiny with the same stoic professionalism she brought to every challenge, but the cumulative effect was exhausting in ways that combat had never been. At least in Afghanistan, her competence had been evaluated based on results rather than assumptions about what a decorated veteran should look like. Governor Patricia Whitman took the podium as the ceremony's keynote speaker, her presence commanding immediate attention from the assembled veterans. Whitman was a former Navy officer herself, someone who understood military culture from personal experience rather than political necessity. Her remarks were scheduled to precede the individual recognition ceremonies that would highlight outstanding veteran achievements. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to recognize veterans who have continued their service to others long after hanging up their uniforms. Governor Whitman began, her voice carrying the authority of both political office and military experience. The transition from military to civilian life presents unique challenges, but the individuals we honor today have demonstrated that the values learned in service, duty, honor, courage, remain relevant long after leaving active duty. Maya listened with professional attention, though her mind wandered to the weeks of preparation that had led to this moment. The recognition ceremony represented validation of her emergency response leadership, but she knew it would also intensify the scrutiny of her military record. Every decoration on her uniform would be examined and questioned by people who couldn't reconcile her appearance with their assumptions about combat veterans. The first set of awards honored veterans who had started successful businesses, their transition from military to civilian leadership serving as examples for others making the same difficult adjustment. Maya applauded politely, recognizing the challenges these individuals had overcome while building something meaningful in the civilian world. The second category recognized veterans who had made significant contributions to education, their military experience translated into teaching and mentoring roles that benefited entire communities. Maya's own work as a professor fell into this category, though her recognition would come later in the ceremony as part of the Emergency Response Leadership Awards. As the ceremony progressed, Maya noticed a commotion near the rear entrance of the auditorium. A group of senior officers had entered quietly, their presence immediately recognizable despite their attempt at discretion. Among them was a figure she recognized from photographs but had never expected to see in person. Colonel James Morrison, her former commanding officer from Afghanistan, now wearing the eagles of a full colonel. Maya's pulse quickened as she recognized other faces in Morrison's group. Command Sergeant Major Rodriguez, the same Rodriguez who had saved her life during the Kandahar ambush. Major Thompson, who had served as the battalion operations officer during her second deployment. These were the people who had witnessed her actions under fire, who had recommended her for the decorations that others now questioned. Morrison's eyes found hers across the crowded auditorium, and he nodded with the subtle acknowledgement that passed between military professionals. Maya felt a flutter of uncertainty, wondering why her former command team had traveled across the country to attend a routine veterans ceremony. Their presence suggested something beyond casual support for a former subordinate's civilian achievements. Governor Whitman called for attention as the ceremony moved into its final phase. Our last category of recognition honors veterans who have demonstrated exceptional leadership in emergency situations, individuals who have applied their military training to save civilian lives. These are the people who step forward when others step back, who bring order to chaos through disciplined application of their military experience. Maya's name was called, along with 4 other veterans, each recognized for different aspects of emergency response leadership. She rose and walked to the stage with measured steps, her bearing unmistakably military despite the civilian setting. The other honorees included a former Air Force pilot who had coordinated hurricane evacuations, a Navy corpsman who had established a mobile medical clinic for homeless veterans, and 2 Army veterans who had developed innovative approaches to disaster response training. As they stood before the assembled audience, Maya caught sight of Morrison and his group moving toward the front of the auditorium. Their positioning suggested something more formal than casual observation, a purpose that became clear as Governor Whitman concluded her remarks about the Emergency Response Awards. "Before we conclude today's ceremony," Governor Whitman announced, "I've been asked to yield the podium to a special guest who has traveled here specifically to address one of our honorees, Colonel James Morrison, United States Army, currently serving as Deputy Commander of the 82nd Airborne Division." Maya's breath caught as Morrison approached the podium, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every veteran in the auditorium. She had served under his command for 2 deployments, had witnessed his leadership during some of the most challenging operations of her military career. His appearance at this ceremony could only mean one thing, though Maya couldn't quite believe the implications. "Thank you, Governor Whitman," Morrison began, his voice carrying the same steady authority that had guided Alpha Company through countless missions in Afghanistan. "I'm here today to address something that has come to the attention of senior military leadership, something that requires immediate clarification and response." The auditorium fell silent, 500 veterans focusing their complete attention on Morrison's words. Maya felt her heart racing as she realized that whatever was about to happen would either vindicate or destroy everything she had worked to build in her civilian career. Over the past several weeks, questions have been raised about the military service record of one of today's honorees, Morrison continued, his gaze finding Maya's position on the stage. Specifically, questions have been raised about the legitimacy of decorations worn by former Staff Sergeant Maya Santos, questions that impugn not only her individual service, but the integrity of the awards process itself. Maya felt the weight of 500 pairs of eyes settling on her, the familiar sensation of scrutiny that had followed her throughout her civilian career. But there was something different in Morrison's tone, something that suggested vindication rather than condemnation. "These questions have been brought to my attention through various channels, including media coverage and official inquiries that have reached the Department of Defense," Morrison said, his voice gaining intensity. "I am here today to address these questions directly and definitively, based on my personal knowledge as Staff Sergeant Santos's commanding officer during the actions for which she was decorated." Morrison paused, letting the significance of his words settle over the assembled audience. Maya found herself holding her breath, uncertain whether vindication or humiliation awaited. On March 15, 2019, Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 82nd Airborne Division was conducting a routine patrol in the Kandahar province of Afghanistan when we were ambushed by a numerically superior enemy force, Morrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of shared memory. The engagement lasted over 4 hours and resulted in 17 casualties among our personnel. Maya closed her eyes briefly, remembering the chaos of that day, the sounds of incoming fire and the cries of wounded soldiers. The memories were as vivid now as they had been in the immediate aftermath, preserved with the crystal clarity that trauma often brings to significant events. Staff Sergeant Santos was serving as our senior combat medic, responsible for the medical care of 32 soldiers under conditions of sustained enemy contact, Morrison said. What she accomplished during those 4 hours represents one of the most extraordinary displays of courage, competence, and dedication I have witnessed in 23 years of military service. The colonel's words carried across the silent auditorium with the force of absolute authority. Maya felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, emotions she had kept carefully controlled for years beginning to surface as her former commander continued his account. While under direct enemy fire, Staff Sergeant Santos moved repeatedly between covered positions to reach wounded personnel, often exposing herself to enemy observation and fire in order to provide life-saving medical treatment, Morrison recounted. She performed emergency surgery in an open field while bullets impacted the ground around her position. She coordinated the evacuation of casualties, while simultaneously engaging enemy forces with her personal weapon. Morrison turned to face Maya directly, his expression reflecting the professional respect that had developed between them during their shared service. But the action that earned Staff Sergeant Santos the Medal of Valor occurred during the final hour of the engagement, when enemy forces attempted to overrun our position and capture wounded personnel who could not be moved. Maya remembered that final hour with perfect clarity, the desperate moments when tactical retreat had been impossible because of the number of casualties requiring immediate medical attention. She had made the decision to remain in position, to continue treating wounded soldiers rather than seeking the safety that tactical withdrawal would have provided. Staff Sergeant Santos made the conscious decision to remain in an exposed position, continuing to provide medical treatment to critically wounded personnel, while enemy forces advanced to within 50 meters of her location, Morrison continued. She directed defensive fire from walking wounded, while performing emergency surgery on casualties who would have died without immediate intervention. The colonel's voice carried the emotion of someone recounting events that had tested the limits of human courage and endurance. Maya felt the attention of the assembled veterans like a physical presence, their focus absolute, as Morrison continued his testimony. When ammunition ran low and enemy forces prepared for a final assault, Staff Sergeant Santos organized the walking wounded into a defensive perimeter around the casualty collection point, turning wounded soldiers into an effective fighting force, while she continued to provide medical care, Morrison said. Her actions during that final hour saved 17 lives and prevented the capture of wounded American personnel by enemy forces. Morrison paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the auditorium. Maya felt the tears she had been fighting finally escape, years of accumulated doubt and skepticism, giving way to the validation she had never expected to receive so publicly. The Medal of Valor was awarded to Staff Sergeant Santos based on witness testimony from 11 soldiers who observed her actions during the engagement, including myself, Morrison continued. The Bronze Star with V device, the Combat Medical Badge, and her other decorations were similarly earned through documented actions witnessed by multiple personnel. The colonel's gaze swept across the assembled veterans, his voice taking on the tone of absolute command that brooked no dissent. I am here today to state unequivocally that every decoration worn by former Staff Sergeant Santos was earned through actions that exemplify the highest traditions of military service. Anyone who questions the legitimacy of her service record is questioning the integrity of the officers who witnessed her actions and the system that validates such extraordinary courage. Morrison stepped away from the podium and moved toward Maya's position on the stage. The other honorees stepped aside as he approached, recognizing the significance of what was about to occur. Maya straightened to attention automatically, 20 years of military conditioning making the response instinctive. Staff Sergeant Santos, Morrison said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. It is my honor to publicly acknowledge your service and sacrifice on behalf of the soldiers whose lives you saved and the nation you served with such distinction. Morrison came to attention and rendered a crisp military salute, the gesture immediately recognized by every veteran in the auditorium. Maya returned the salute with tears streaming down her face, the simple acknowledgement representing vindication of everything she had endured during her civilian career. The auditorium erupted in applause, 500 veterans rising to their feet in recognition of what they had just witnessed. The sound was overwhelming, a thunderous acknowledgement that transcended rank, branch of service, and generational differences. Maya felt the weight of years of doubt and skepticism lifting from her shoulders as she stood before an audience that finally understood the truth of her service. But Morrison wasn't finished. As the applause began to subside, he stepped back to the podium, his expression serious despite the emotional moment that had just occurred. There is one additional matter that requires attention, Morrison announced, his words immediately focusing the audience's attention. Staff Sergeant Santos's service record has been reviewed at the highest levels of the Department of Defense in response to the questions that have been raised about her decorations. Maya felt a flutter of concern, wondering what additional scrutiny her record had received. Morrison's expression suggested something significant. though she couldn't determine whether the implications were positive or negative. Based on that review, and in recognition of her continued service to others through emergency response leadership and military education, the Secretary of the Army has approved Staff Sergeant Santos for promotion to the rank of Sergeant First Class, effective immediately, Morrison announced. Maya's legs nearly buckled as she processed Morrison's words. The promotion represented not only individual recognition, but institutional validation of her service at the highest levels of military leadership. It was acknowledgement that her contributions had been significant enough to warrant continued recognition years after her active service had ended. Morrison approached Maya again, this time carrying a small box that contained the insignia of her new rank. The ceremony that followed was brief but profound, the simple act of pinning new rank insignia, transforming years of civilian doubt into military validation. As Morrison stepped back, the assembled veterans rose again in applause, their recognition even more thunderous than before. Maya stood at attention, overwhelmed by emotions she had kept carefully controlled for years. The validation was complete and absolute, witnessed by an audience that understood the significance of what had just occurred. Governor Whitman returned to the podium as the ceremony concluded, her remarks brief but heartfelt. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just witnessed something extraordinary. The public vindication of a veteran whose service has been questioned despite overwhelming evidence of her courage and competence. Sergeant First Class Santos represents the best traditions of military service, both during her active duty and in her continued contributions to her community. As the formal ceremony ended, Maya found herself surrounded by veterans who wanted to shake her hand, offer congratulations, and acknowledge her service. The response was overwhelming after years of skepticism and doubt, a reminder of the bonds that connected those who had served regardless of their individual experiences. Morrison approached as the crowd began to thin, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished an important mission. Maya, I want you to know that this recognition is long overdue. Your actions in Afghanistan saved lives, and your continued service as a civilian has made a difference in your community. Maya struggled to find words adequate to express her gratitude. Sir, I don't know what to say. I never expected anything like this. You earned it, Morrison replied simply. Every bit of recognition you received today was earned through actions that exemplify the best of military service. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Command Sergeant Major Rodriguez joined them, his weathered face reflecting the same satisfaction that Maya saw in Morrison's expression. Santos, you remember what I told you after the Kandahar ambush. I said you had the heart of a warrior. Today proved that warriors come in all shapes and sizes. Maya smiled through her tears, remembering Rodriguez's words from that day in the field hospital when she was recovering from her own wounds. The validation from the men who had served alongside her carried more weight than any civilian recognition could provide. As the evening progressed, Maya found herself at the center of conversations that would have been impossible just hours earlier. Veterans who had questioned her credentials now sought her perspective on military service and civilian transition. The transformation was complete and absolute, doubt replaced by recognition and respect. The drive home took Maya through familiar streets that somehow looked different in the aftermath of the ceremony. The validation she had received changed everything, not because her service record had been altered, but because it had been publicly acknowledged by people whose opinion carried unquestionable authority. Maya's apartment felt different as well, transformed from a refuge from civilian skepticism into a space where she could finally display her military achievements without defensive preparation for challenges and questions. The Medal of Valor no longer needed to be hidden or explained. It had been publicly validated by the officer who had recommended it and witnessed the actions for which it was awarded. Her phone rang as she settled at her desk, the caller ID showing Rodriguez's contact information. Maya answered with anticipation, knowing that the conversation would be different from any they had shared since her transition to civilian life. Congratulations, Sergeant First Class, Rodriguez said, her voice carrying obvious satisfaction. That was long overdue recognition of your service and continued contributions. Thank you, Captain. I still can't quite believe it actually happened. Believe it. And there's something else you should know. The Regional Mass Casualty Response Team proposal has been approved at the state level. The governor wants you to lead the medical component, with full authority over emergency medical response throughout the state. Maya felt a surge of excitement at the opportunity. combined with the confidence that came from public validation of her expertise. I'm definitely interested in hearing more about the position. Good, because they want to move quickly. The construction site incident demonstrated the need for a systematic mass casualty response, and your leadership during that emergency convinced everyone that you're the right person for the job. After ending the call, Maya returned to the documentation she had been working on before the ceremony, her after-action report from the Meridian Tower disaster. The systematic approach she had implemented had saved lives through proper resource allocation and unified command structure, demonstrating the continued relevance of her military training in civilian emergency response. The report would become part of the official record, but it would also serve as the foundation for developing standardized mass casualty protocols throughout the state. Maya's expertise, no longer questioned or doubted, would be applied to training civilian responders in the systematic approaches that had proven effective in both combat and civilian emergencies. Maya's reflection was interrupted by a knock at her door, unexpected at such a late hour. She opened it to find Jessica, one of her most dedicated students, holding a bottle of champagne and wearing a smile that threatened to split her face. Professor Santos. Sergeant First Class Santos. I saw the ceremony on the news, Jessica said, her excitement barely contained. I just had to come congratulate you in person. What happened today was incredible. Maya invited Jessica inside, grateful for the company and the opportunity to share her emotions with someone who understood the significance of what had occurred. The student had recognized Maya's expertise from their first class together, evaluating her teaching based on competence rather than assumptions about her background. I always knew you were special, Jessica continued as they settled in Maya's living room. The techniques you taught us, the way you approached emergency medicine. It was obvious you had experience that went beyond textbooks. But seeing Colonel Morrison salute you on television, hearing him describe what you did in Afghanistan, it gave me chills. Maya smiled at the young woman's enthusiasm, remembering her own excitement as a student learning from instructors who had real-world experience to share. The principles remain the same whether you're treating casualties in a combat zone or responding to civilian emergencies. Assess, prioritize, act. Everything else is just context. They talked for over an hour, Jessica asking questions about military service and emergency response that Maya finally felt free to answer without defensive preparation. The validation she had received changed everything, allowing her to share her expertise without worrying about skepticism or doubt. After Jessica left, Maya returned to her desk and opened her laptop, beginning to draft a response to the state's offer regarding the mass casualty response team position. The opportunity represented everything she had worked toward during her civilian career: official recognition of her expertise, authority to implement systematic approaches to emergency response, and the chance to make a meaningful difference in her community. The position would bring new challenges, Maya knew. Public scrutiny would intensify, and every decision she made would be analyzed and critiqued by officials and media who might not understand the harsh realities of emergency medical response. But she had faced far greater challenges than civilian oversight and emerged stronger. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from Sergeant Mitchell, the paramedic who had initially challenged her authority during the construction site emergency. Saw the ceremony on the news. Proud to have served under your command. Looking forward to working with you again. The message represented the transformation that Maya had witnessed throughout the day, doubt and skepticism replaced by recognition and respect. The truth of her service had finally been acknowledged in a way that transcended individual encounters and established her credibility permanently. As midnight approached, Maya completed her response to the state position offer, accepting the role of regional medical commander with enthusiasm and gratitude. The systematic approaches she had developed through military experience would be applied to civilian emergency response on a statewide basis, potentially saving hundreds of lives through proper resource allocation and unified command structure. Maya prepared for bed with a sense of completion she hadn't experienced since leaving active duty. The ceremony had provided closure to years of civilian doubt and skepticism, replacing uncertainty with recognition and respect that came from the highest levels of military authority. Her decorations had been validated, her expertise acknowledged, and her continued service recognized. The Medal of Valor rested in its case on her dresser, no longer a source of defensive preparation but a symbol of achievements that had been publicly acknowledged and respected. Maya had earned that decoration through 4 hours of sustained combat, treating 17 wounded soldiers while under direct enemy fire. The same systematic approach that had saved those lives had proven effective during civilian emergencies, demonstrating the continued relevance of military training and experience. Maya's last conscious thought before sleep was of the soldiers whose lives she had saved during that March day in Afghanistan. Their trust had been absolute and unquestioning, based on competence demonstrated under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Today's ceremony had extended that trust to the civilian world, providing recognition that transcended skepticism and doubt. The validation was complete and permanent, witnessed by an audience that understood the significance of military service and sacrifice. Maya had proven herself under combat conditions, had earned her decorations through actions that exemplified the highest traditions of military service, and had continued that service in civilian roles that made a meaningful difference in her community. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to apply her expertise, new challenges that would test her abilities in different contexts. But Maya would face those challenges with the confidence that came from public recognition of her competence, official validation of her achievements, and the knowledge that her service had made a lasting difference in the lives of others. The construction site emergency had demonstrated her ability to adapt military expertise to civilian challenges, while today's ceremony had provided the recognition that such adaptation deserved. Maya's journey from questioned veteran to respected leader was complete, marked by the simple but profound gesture of a colonel's salute and the acknowledgement of peers who finally understood the truth of her service. The systematic approaches she had developed through military experience would continue to save lives in civilian contexts, her expertise finally recognized and respected by those who understood the value of proven competence over superficial assumptions. Maya had earned her place among America's most respected veterans, not through political connection or social influence, but through actions that had saved lives and demonstrated the highest standards of military service. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.